Comics have long been a part of American culture for over 100 years. From superheroes to slice of life stories, they've long been a popular medium for children and more recently for adults as well. Comics have also been an incredibly useful vehicle for talking about history. Our panel today is part of a huge group of writers who are introducing histories to a reading public that doesn't always frequent museums or nonfiction books. In doing so, they're letting people of all ages get excited about history and providing young people with books in school that are engaging and more familiar to their day-to-day lives than static textbooks. So our panel is comprised of the following creators. First, David Walker. David Walker is the award-winning comic writer of The Black Panther Party, a graphic novel history. He's also a celebrated scholar of African-American cinema and a scribe for numerous titles for Marvel, DC Comics, Dynamite, Dark Horse, including Luke Cage, Occupy Avengers, Cyborg, and Shaft. So welcome, David. Next, we have Justin Eisinger. Justin Eisinger is the co-author of the New York Times best-selling graphic memoir, They Called Us Enemy, George Takei's story of childhood internment during World War II. And that book is from right here. He is also he recently served as the editorial director of graphic novels and collections at IDW Publishing. And finally, we have Brian Hawkins. Brian Hawkins is the co-author of Black Cotton, which is a unique contribution to our panel. It's a comic set in an alternate reality where white people are an oppressed minority in America, and a black officer connected with a powerful family kills a white woman. This story makes clear allusions to the murder of George Floyd and other police in America, grappling with an incredibly current history in a very creative and interesting way. So welcome to all three of you. Thanks for being here. So my first question, it's a broad one, but I'd love all three of you to answer, which is, how did your comic histories come about? How did you decide to create the historical narratives, or in the case of Brian Hawkins, the alternate historical narrative that you did? What prompted you to write them? If we could start with David, that'd be great.
Sure. Well, I'd always been fascinated with the history of the Black Panther Party, and in particular, very frustrated with the lack of information that I'd been given when I was, coming up in school, high school, things like that, which was absolutely nothing about them. And so I always wanted to tell some story as it related to the Black Panthers. And I ended up writing The Life of Frederick Douglass for 10 Speed Press, a graphic novel for them. And when we had wrapped that book, the conversation went to what's next. And it just very quickly turned to, well, what about the Black Panther Party? And at the time I was sort of envisioning something that was a little bit narrower in its focus, thinking, I basically wanted to do the story of Fred Hampton and the Illinois Party. And, but then realized that without the context of the entire party, it wasn't going to work. And that not everybody had spent decades of their lives obsessing over the party. So first I needed to give everyone a crash course. And so that's how it came together.
Justin.
Let me just fanboy for a second. I'm a huge fan of David's work, and Black Panther Party was spectacular, and as was the Frederick Douglass book, which was really great. And so I've really enjoyed your output, specifically at 10 Speed recently. So congratulations.
Thank you.
To answer quickly, my sort of inspiration really begins in a sort of a different lane, which was in 2015, I think it was. I had the very incredible good fortune of crossing paths with the late Congressman John Lewis. I was asked to film his historic recreation cosplay march at San Diego Comic-Con. That led to me interacting with him on several occasions, and most importantly, spending a great deal of time interviewing adults, standing in line to meet him and have them sign their books at an event. And while doing this, I got to witness very firsthand and a high degree of tactility, people that had maybe no idea of the truth, the details of his story, and graphic novels maybe as a true tool, standing in line, reading this book, and it would change them in the course of an hour waiting for their autograph. I would watch them read a book and change their reality. That for me unlocked the power of graphic novels as the true potential of what this medium could do. And I began really sort of as a person working in publishing, as a book editor, as an editorial director, thinking, what other pieces of really crucial American history have been overlooked and might benefit from of this treatment? That led me fortuitously to thinking about, my gosh, I learned a little bit about this in school, but George Takei has spent decades telling everyone about his experience during this really shameful part of America's history that's very much not in the past. I mean, it's in the 1940s, but that's not so long ago. It's literally living history, and I thought it was an amazing opportunity to capture someone who lived firsthand this experience and have them help us shape it into a medium that could address a really wide audience and get that right brain, left brain connective tissue of, these are the facts, this is what it felt like, please process that and think about it, and that was sort of how They Called Us Enemy came together.
And Brian.
Yeah, so Black Cotton came about, if I go backwards a little bit, a few years back, I was tinkering with an idea, with a story for several years actually, about a what if, with America. And I actually self-published it, and one of my colleagues, when I was teaching, bought a copy, and he read it, and he began reading some of my other works that I've self-published. And he had a mutual friend who's a comic book collector. He was like, man, this guy has like an idea, and you write comics. I think you guys should link. And so we eventually linked up last January at lunch, and he was like, and that's Patrick Foreman, my co-writer, and he was like, look, man, I have this idea, like the whole world is reversed, like flipped. History's just flipped, and like even to the point where the cotton's black. And I'm like, stop, that's it, Black Cotton, that's the title. And so from that point on, like at lunch, we talked and built the story out, the concept of the vehicle, how we were going to present this reverse world. We went back to his house, and we just began to just do this deep dive of what this reversed world would look like. And that, of course, led to more building, more structuring, and we began to look at history and, what parts of history we would use, like the choices made, how different choices could create different opportunities and different situations and different events. And that became Black Cotton.
And Black Cotton, and Brian, we actually talked on Twitter about this like 6 months ago or whatever it was. It's such a powerful book because it really does feel like it's informed by very, very current history. And that's really true of all three of your books, right? There's these really clear allusions to the modern day that may have been on purpose and may not have been. Obviously, internment camps have been a major issue in American culture recently, police brutality as well. And David, one of the moments in your book that really stuck out to me was the story of Denzel Dowell, who just felt so similar to the story of George Floyd, a Black man who's murdered by a police officer who he knows. Was that reality, was that informing the decisions you were making as you were writing?
Well, not as much. I was trying to stick as much to history, to the actual facts, but in terms of my mood, my general disposition of, what I was thinking and feeling as I was writing the book, the news was constantly influencing me. The news was constantly making me think, well, maybe we need to pick up guns again. Maybe, where are the Black Panthers when we need them now? And there were these moments for me where I was like, I don't want my book to be relevant. I don't want my book to be relevant to the times right now. It was, you hope that one day you wake up and there'll be like such massive police reform that there'll never be another Denzel Dowell, or there'll never be another George Floyd. There'll, never be another, Sandra Bland. I mean, the list goes on and on. And I think that, for me, it was, there was almost on a daily basis. It was this feeling of like, oh, there's another story in the news. You know, it's like this, it's the same story every single time. It's just the city changes and the name of the person changes, and were they shot or were they choked or were they, you know, what is it? But it's the same thing. And you begin to realize, well, it's not like police brutality was invented in the 1960s, because, you know, this has been going on, and every major situation of racial unrest in this country, every single one has its roots in if not police brutality, then at least white supremacy and violence against people of color.
Justin, kind of a similar question for you. You know, dealing with a book that's about internment camps. And obviously, this happened in the 1940s. It's a very personal story of George Takei's. But was it nipping in the back of any of you or your creative team's mind that, you know, this might be a recapping of something that feels very relevant to some people?
Yes, and I'm going to first apologize for the car alarm you're probably hearing in my microphone right now. If you bear with me for 1 second, I can get a dog to bark, but make the car alarm go away. So forgive me. Yes, quickly, just kind of what David was just saying. You know, it all starts with sort of an othering. This idea that, you know, when you can draw oftentimes artificial divisions amongst groups of people, and you create this idea that there's factions working against each other. I wish I could say like him that this wasn't a foundation of our book, but it very much was. You know, the genesis of They Called Us Enemy was October of 2016, actually at the Javits Center in New York City, of all places. And part of it was definitely this thought of, not only is this a story that is not at all spoken about, and we have an incredible you know, individual here who has a huge following and can be a great person to share that history, you know, a great tip of the spear to sort of get this story out there. But also that I mean, I just kind of got waffled there, guys. Sorry, but oh yeah, but it was the fall of 16. You know, the previous administration was seeming like that was a thing that could happen, and this idea of, I remember thinking about travel bans and Muslim bans, and I think at that time I sort of was thinking, my gosh, I have Muslim family members, and I'm thinking they're going to end up being on the receiving end of some sorts of prejudices. And wow, won't this be a strange, terrible, horrible coincidence? Never could have imagined that when it took a veer and went in all the additional extreme directions that it did, you know. But I mean, very much inspired sort of by the times and the sense that things could go wrong.
And Brian, I mean, your story is very literally about things going wrong, right? So when you're dealing with the things that are going very wrong in society right now through your alternate lens, what made you decide to tackle those issues in the way that you did? Why not just make a traditional history of police shootings? Why instead make this kind of powerful alternate world?
So we wanted to really try to capture the human condition through a very specific event. With the shooting, that was really a seminal event. Like in real life, you know, I mean, going back to Trayvon Martin, that's a seminal event. And I think it's a marker of, I mean, it's happened so many times. There's countless examples in events of police brutality and just so many wrongdoings. But for me, Martin was like a marker. And for me, I know something changed. There was a realization. And so we chose to start Black Cotton with that more modern event, even though it is history now, to really capture the idea of the problem, of this problem within the human condition. And it's like, for Black Cotton, it's a marker of the overall systemic problem. And with that, we just want to explore the other kinds of events that comes from racism, from this have and have not, the social class. And so we just started with a police shooting because it was like a hallmark, a marker, something that would bring in the emotion, the relatability, because it's right there. It's near to us.
So you all write comics, obviously. That's why we're all here, right? But you chose to you chose to tell history through your kind of unique lenses, and really different lenses, and we'll get to that in a minute. But does the comic medium offer anything that's particularly valuable in history telling that other mediums might not offer? And also, does it have any shortcomings?
Well, I'll start. Books are better with pictures in them. Say plain and simple as that. You know, I am a strong believer in the medium of comics, and that the definition of comics can be very flexible. So it's this joining of text and image, and you know, as someone who has always loved reading, I know that, you know, I was probably like in 5th grade and my heart broke a little bit, because that's when books stopped having pictures in them. You know, we learned to read with picture books. And as someone who's worked in education, I've watched a lot of hesitant readers back away from books that have big blocks of text and no imagery in it. And I feel like there's a lot to be said for meeting the people where they are, as opposed to expecting them to catch up to you, right? And if traditional history books and history texts and publishers aren't willing to tell the story of whether it's you know, the Black Panther Party or internment camps, or just about whatever aspect of history that very few of us are getting in public school, then it's up to us to do it, right? And the thing is when I was a kid, I would have much rather had a graphic novel like, you know, the Black Panther Party or the Frederick Douglass book. There's, you know, I'm a grown man who still looks at books that, when there's, you know, David Blight wrote a great book about Frederick Douglass, but it's like 900 pages and barely any pictures, and I'm still fighting my way to get through it. I am very much, I'm a very simple man in that way. I like my pictures, and I just think that I think that most people, most of us learn through a juxtaposition of text and imagery, and most of us learn how to read that way. And I think that it's almost ingrained in us to be drawn towards the visual. There's a reason why you know, a box of cereal has a, you know, picture of cereal on it and a tiger going, you know, they're great, because that resonates with us, and it also triggers our imagination, and it helps us. It helps us to visualize, and then we can, if we want to go beyond that, we can, in terms of how we think and how we extrapolate information. So to me, it's not a question of what's great about this medium. It's a question of, why don't we see more people doing it? Why don't we see more graphic novels like this? You know, it's especially because young people, you know, they gravitate towards it, and shouldn't we need to be doing more stuff for young people, right? Like I always say that I have no interest in writing to middle-aged people my own age. They're, you know, we're boring, and we've already let the world go to pot. So
there we go.
Right. I was, it's great, David. I was watching that movie Inception a couple months ago, and it hit back on the streaming services. And I remember there's a part where Leonardo DiCaprio says, "Inception is so hard." And I was working on a script right then. I was like, "Have you tried writing a book? Like, just you can incept that. A lot of people, you just put the idea in a book, and there you go. It happens all the time, guys. Come on." Yeah, I love that idea, and I've said that before. Like you know, and it's really, I know it's hokey when I say it, but it still makes me well up when I do. It's like, if you can put these history or these complicated ideas in a format that you can pass on anything that I've learned in my time or have witnessed in my time, and it can help somebody be their best self, or skip any of the hardships that I've experienced in trying to learn something, or mistakes I've made or other people have made, than we are making the world a better place, like one person at a time. And I mean, you do that enough times, back to baby steps from earlier, and you're going to have potentially a real tsunami of positive force that you can put out in the world. Just, it might not seem so obvious in the incremental steps in which it happens.
And Brian, you have firsthand experience with this, right? Because you actually worked in classrooms seeing kids read these comics.
Yeah. And they would go to the library and they would check out graphic novels. Like, that was their thing. Like, and I used to tell them, like, human beings process data through images, right? And so we used to do this whole thing where, like, I would stand there and I'll say, like, cheeseburger. And, I'm like, what is happening in your mind? What do you see? Do you see the letters cheeseburger, or do you see an image or some type of image that references a cheeseburger for you? And they're like, oh my goodness, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I feel like, well, one, comics are dope, but two, like, that really hits in on who we are as human beings. Like, we're visual. Like, even when we're reading prose, we are developing and creating images that references that goes to those words. So if you create, a graphic novel, a comic book, and you have the text and you have the image, it's literally the best of both worlds. It's literally like who we are. It's what we do. It's just out in front of us now.
I have no formal training to say this officially, but I call that the left brain, right brain effect. And it's sort of that if you can build that aha moment right up there on the page, where it's the symphony of the, you're building to it with your captions and your dialogue, and which is the whole structure, and the images are building it, and the reader can really assemble it all there in their own mind. I think that there's something special about the medium, and that it allows us to have that space to share without so much, with a little bit of ambiguity there for the person to have it happen in their own head.
Well, this is crucial. This also gets into, right brain, left brain psychology sort of thing. But if you're reading a book about, or reading something about a real event or real people, and you see a picture of that person or those people, it becomes more real to us, right? Okay, I'm going to write an article about, Frederick Douglass, and here's a picture of Frederick Douglass. Oh, he was a real person. When you make something of an abstraction, which is what comics are, they're an abstraction of reality, right? They're renderings of reality. It engages a different type of imagination, right? So I can look at a drawing of Frederick Douglass and so this is what Frederick Douglass looked like, except this is a cartoon. And now I have to process that it's part of the, almost like the willing suspension of disbelief, right? When we see a photograph, we take that the photograph is real, right? And it engages us in a more intellectual, logical way, whereas an illustration, a painting, engages us in a way in which we have to leap to or move to that conclusion of this is a representation of something real. And it's that, to me, is part of what makes, is what made this medium so amazing. And it's the reason why it took so long, I think, for film to, if we're going to move out of the genre of nonfiction, but just like the comic book movies, part of the reason it took so long was it took technology, filmmaking technology, to get to a place where that abstraction, where that imagination could be projected onto screen in such a way that we didn't all look at it and go, well, that looks fake, so it's interesting. I mean, we're just now, right now, there's some kid, 10, 11 years old, who is going to grow up to be like the penultimate scholar of comics, and that will take this, what we're doing, seriously. And as an instructor myself, I teach at Portland State University, but there's very few degree programs in comic studies, but that's going to change. And at the risk of sounding like full of myself, like, we're all part of that change right now. These books that we're talking about, it's interesting to me, and this is to Justin, it's as a teacher, everyone talked about mouse for the last 30 something years. And it's like, And I've been saying, hey, Mouse is a great book. You know, Spiegelman, he knocked it out the park. Could we please have something else, right? And you know, they call this enemy. Is that something else? It's like, finally there's this book that's like, oh, see, it only took nearly 40 years for us to get there. Now, hopefully, and there's so many other stories to be told, you know, there's, so yeah, I'm geeking out right now just because the possibilities of what we can do in this medium are endless. The only thing that limits us is our imagination.
The time to have somebody draw it, and the
that too.
imagination.
Yeah. And the budget.
I was just
Let's
saying,
not forget the budget.
I think David, what you said. I mean, Brian and David, you both made great points. And I think, David, if I could just put a word to the theme you were talking about, was just empathy.
Yeah.
The graphic novels are incredible at establishing empathy, because it's one thing to hear about. I'll go back to March. It's one thing to hear about John Lewis and his group walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and getting beaten by the police. We've heard about it. You've seen photos. It's another when you open the book and there's the Billy Club and it's coming at you and you see it happen. And then again, that emotion, that, you know, we don't have budgets in graphic novels. You can show as big of a thing as you want. You just have to, you know, again, your artist is going to hate you if he has to draw a million little detailed things. But other than that, yeah, we know we're not bound by time and constraint and budgets like some other mediums are. So you can do things like jump across time and space if you have to go from one scene to the next. And that's something that we worked on really hard with George Takei. George, of course, millions of followers. He's not been shy about sharing his experiences for years. But as far as I was aware, no one had ever done what we did, which is really layer the actual history right over the events he was living. And so we could go from what he was experiencing in a horse stable in Santa Ana, Santa Ana, and then Santa Anita, I'm so sorry, and then cut immediately to Washington, D.C. and show a bunch of angry white men in suits yelling, you know, bloviating back and forth at each other about, you know, this, that, and the other. And one of the things that was so disheartening to me, and during my research for the book and working on the book, and then listening to the news unfolding right over my shoulder, like every night as I'm working on the script, was the cycle has not broken. It is continuing to go on. We are we're hung up on the exact same complications today as we were, you know, 50 years ago or 60 years ago. And how are we ever going to fix that? You know, and that was one of the things that was really frustrating, was going, oh my God, this is happening again. And I don't know how we're ever going to get off this merry-go-round.
The paradigm shift that has to happen, you know, for a certain group of people. When I say certain group, like a certain number, you know, it doesn't have to be the majority, because I believe like the majority of human beings, you know, I do believe they want what is good, but it's a certain number, whatever that is, group, that their mindset has to shift and change. And I think that, you know, that only happens through inspiration, through like what we're doing, what so many different artists and writers and you know, musicians are doing. And if we put enough of that out there, and it keeps building and building and building and building, you know, I have to believe that the universe, you know, that energy, it will create that paradigm shift. It's just, we have to get to that point and not give up.
So, no, I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
I was going to say, I agree with that. I think that there is no destination that we're going to where we can go, oh, we're here, right? You know, we think we if history has taught us anything, there's milestones in which we go, oh, you know, we're here. No, we're not. You know, it's the election of Barack Obama as president of the United States did not signal an end to, you know, a lot of the problems that we have in this country, both from a you know, from a race standpoint, from a class standpoint, from a political standpoint, and we just have to keep pushing.
So I want to shift a little bit back to some of the specifics of your books. And Justin, I'll start with you. You did this really, and I imagine George had something to say about this as well, but you did this really wonderful thing in They Call This Enemy, where from the perspective of child George Takei, you go through these incredible indignities, and young George is like having a blast in the midst of these indignities, because he thinks it's like a trip and it's fun. and doesn't process the reality that his parents are going through, where everything they've ever worked for is taken from them, and then they're being put into a camp based on their ethnicity and their race. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that choice, and how whether or not it was purposefully that powerful to show a child in that position to be going through something that is an incredible indignity, but it's their normal, so they just think it's fine.
Right. Thanks, Matt. That's a great question, and it was something that we really informed so much of working on the book. I can't lie to this group. When we started the book, we were kind of like, hey, let's do a biography about George Takei. And that changed a lot to being a book very specifically about this particular chapter of his life and what it meant, not only for his life, but America's, history as well. I mean, it's so many ways. For starters, from the art perspective, it's very difficult to draw, a child and to base everything in a child's point of view and give it sort of the gravitas that the story deserved. My editor, Lee Walton, had the good fortune of finding Harmony Becker at a TCAF or some other sort of kind of indie comic show at her table, and recognized that she had an art style that looked like it would be really great for the book, and it sure enough did. I mean, she won a National Cartoonist Society award from her work on it, just because she managed to walk that line of, like you say, kind of capturing a childhood innocence while also juxtaposing it against the indignities, as you said, these really just terrible things that happened. And something we spoke about on a panel a week or two ago was just also that something we went with the black and white palette with a little bit of gray tones, but she also, having a little bit of manga art influence, was able to add a lot of sort of lighting effects, or sort of like rendered artifacts sort of in the coloring that she would use to kind of dial up the emotions up and down. And you can see sort of how that takes place in some of the different stories. One that comes to mind right off the top of my head is there's a scene in camp where Santa Claus comes around to the kids, and there's this wonder from the children that Santa Claus found us in camp. Oh my gosh. And she's got all these sort of artifacts in the lighting and in the shading that really add this sort of wonder, sort of manga wonder with wide eyes and whatnot. And so that was something we really had to go back and forth. And then obviously she spent a lot of time drawing, like I said before, angry white men, whether it be FDR or, oh my gosh, the Supreme Court Justice, who I'm completely blanking on off the top of my head, and just, or battleships or jeeps or these camps. And one of the things that, yes, and I'll wrap this up, is Harmony actually traveled to a few of the Manzanar, and I think at least one other camp, to go do some physical research for the book. And just took a lot of her own photos, did a lot of her own research, and had a really good sense of sort of like the history and what things looked like. And, sure enough, there was times when even her research and photos we'd find online, George would say, no, that wasn't what it was like. And there'd be that, he was very, very involved in making sure everything was absolutely to his experience and speaking to his, we centered the whole thing around his experience. And it was a challenge.
And Brian, similarly, you and the first issue of Black Cotton, I don't want to spoil the first issue for anyone, but it's been out for a while. So where a police officer says to the white family of the victim, what do we need? What will it cost to make this go away? Which felt very much like a kind of nod to the suppression of police brutality for years that kind of came to a head in the past 6 or 7 years. And I was just curious as to what you were trying to capture with the conclusion of book one.
So with the Cotton family, being the 1%, it's a Black family that, because the social order is reversed, where white and Black, the social order. So you have a 1% elitist family, the Cottons, and so they have sway. They have power. Their mindset is that this is their world, and so that in turn includes, all of the officials, the judicial system, all those institutions that are in place in our world, is in place in their world. It's just that they are the haves instead of the have-nots. So what we're getting at is just the power of social classes, and how the actual color that matters most is green, and that, you know, black and white become different sects or categories or groupings of black and white, you know, become an extension of that, of who's controlling the green. And institutions fall behind that same line, who controls the green. And the Cottons are this family that control that. And so this social order allows them to make problems potentially go away, to and that's how, you know, we see a lot of injustices take place and happen, is because of who people are. Not necessarily what color they are, but who they are. But color and race and ethnicity, sometimes gender, are all symptoms that factor in to that as well.
David, you did a thing in your comic that I thought was really interesting. You sort of broke a rule, right? You mentioned like pictures are books with pictures make things better, and your comic, Black Panther Party graphic novel, has a significant amount of text for a comic, and that wasn't a bad thing. That was actually really informative. You did this really interesting thing where you had these like pretty heavy text blocks accompanied with, you know, a single image or two single images as kind of an overview vignette of what you were about to talk about. And then you went into the kind of blow by blow, almost stray bullets sort of account of different instances that your Black Panther characters deal with. What made you format this way and kind of take that big risk in formatting?
Well, it's actually really an interesting story. Excuse me. There's two different worlds in this industry right now. There is the traditional comic book publisher world, which is Marvel, DC, IDW, Image, Boom, Dark Horse, all of them. And then there is the book publishing world, in which 10 Speed, my publisher, is part of, Scholastic is part of. There's a whole bunch of book publishers that are now doing graphic novels. And a lot of them are using outdated contracts and ideas of what a book should be. And so they have higher word counts. Like when you're writing a comic book, there's no word count, there's a page count. Plain and simple as that. But when you're writing a graphic novel for a traditional book publisher, a lot of times there's an actual word count of how many of the words will appear in the book. And so that was, it was something that I had to deal with Frederick Douglass. And in some ways it's very, it can be difficult, but then in other times it's actually really helpful because there's so much more information you have to get through. The biggest, most difficult part of it is essentially training your artist to look at a page and see how much text there is. And I'm pretty good at, you know, page 25. Okay, here we go. It's going to be a lot of text. You know, I tell them, with Marcus especially, I was like, man, if you draw too many backgrounds, if you draw too much detail, it's just going to get covered anyway. So don't do it. And I've talked to some other writers who are dealing with graphic novels at other publishers, and a couple of friends of mine called me when they got their first contract, and they were like, you had a word count? And I was like, yeah, you got one too, right? Okay, so here's how because in traditional comics, there's a whole other way. There really is a math to it, for me anyway. There's like these mathematic equations. And so I would have to figure out, okay, what's the maximum amount of text I can fit on a page and still have room for art? And then also, what kind of art is this going to be? Because when you're doing a nonfiction historical text, there's, you know, history doesn't necessarily unfold like a comic book. And, you know, if you're just trying to explain who Huey P. Newton was, like, Huey P. Newton isn't going to be fighting the Incredible Hulk, right? So you need a good picture of Huey and some text. But then there was other aspects to the history of the Panthers that we were, both Marcus and myself were very, you know, aware of, that, yeah, we can tell this story primarily visually and we can cut the text out. And then then Marcus gets to be the true storyteller here. He gets to be the conveyor of information, even if I've worked out how, you know, the choreography of a scene. So when the Panthers stormed the Capitol in Sacramento, it's like, okay, we plotted out the beats. Okay, panel one will look like this, panel two will look like this, but there's hardly any text. And that's where, like, that was so much fun, because that's what I do, right? I write comics. I'm not, you know, not a history writer per se. I'm just a dope who writes comics and with bibliographies in them.
Well said.
Yeah, I was gonna say that the old show don't tell thing for sure was something that we fell on a lot. Was, you know, we have just hours and hours and hours of listening to George tell his stories over and over and over again, and you know, us asking questions and trying to really dig in all of them. But then, right, you have to sort of be like, okay, well, how am I going to really show this? Because I can do a couple different approaches. And thinking about David describing the Black Panther book and Frederick Douglass, and by the way, the interstitial text portions of Frederick Douglass were hugely informative, and definitely taught me a lot about Virginia history that I didn't know, which was not altogether favorable history, of course. But you know, I think sometimes, like, that style, that mixing of sort of our graphic novel backgrounds and sort of this new idea of pushing information in as highly parsable of a manner as possible is I've been calling it, it's a new sort of infographic.
Yeah,
it's like infographic novel, sort of, is a sort of a phrase I've kicked around a couple times. Because yeah, we're treading a little bit different waters. You know, you're bringing a lot of different visual storytelling techniques into one sort of timeline and saying, hey, this all makes sense, go read it.
Yeah, Blair Imani has a book out. I want to say the title is, I cannot remember the title. It's published by 10 Speed, which is my publisher, but it's a book about the Great Migration, when African Americans left the South and started moving north and west. And it's a historical book. There's no panel to panel sequences. There's no sequential art, but all of the art in it is original illustration. And so it's very much like a history book that you would read, but instead of photographs, there are illustrations instead. And I'm seeing more and more instances of this popping up. And you're right, it's not quite a graphic novel, but it's no longer a traditional historical text either. Right. And it's interesting because with Blair Imani's book, which it's going to drive me nuts that I can't remember the name, but with the book, it's like, yeah, there's images in there that I've seen 1,000 times before. There, you know, but this image of Malcolm X is, instead of the original photograph, it's now an illustration, and there's something about it. There's something for me that, you know, that I can't quite explain what it is, but it's there, and it's engaging. And I think we're going to see more of that. I think we're going to see more of these sort of hybrids, like these infographic graphic novels. And if nothing else, and this is a kind of a funny aside, I just had a conversation with a state library association. We're still trying to explain to people that when we say graphic novel, that it doesn't mean pornographic, right? And so there are still teachers and librarians and community leaders who honestly do not know that we're just talking about comic books with more pages.
Right. Wow. Yeah.
Well, I think we're going to get infographic novel to catch on. This whole group is committed to pushing that forward, right?
Yeah. Cool. I like it.
Tweet it.
Yeah.
So a couple people have been talking in the chat, and by the way, for the audience, if you do have questions, please do put them in the chat. Deborah Goss mentioned, kind of highlighting what you were just saying, that the stories that she read as a child in Classics Illustrated taught her about famous plots, and the pictures made her want to know about the characters, and that subsequently made her read some of the actual books. And I suspect that's also true of histories, which leads me to a question that Chris Dainmeyer put in the chat, which is, who are some of the creators who have influenced you in your work? I'd like to know specifically your historical or ahistorical work, but obviously I'm interested in any of the work you're doing.
Okay, yeah, I'll jump in. So I'm gonna go with my favorite writer, possibly my favorite thinker, is Du Bois. And for Black Cotton, you know, I really did think about a lot of, you know, of what I've read from him and about him. I remember in undergrad, I had a class where, one of the best classes ever, where you read and you just sit there and you talk. And like, that was it. We read this book and we sat there and we went to work on it. We talked and we were building on what he was saying. And I mean, it's just, and that kind of really has carried over. Like, you know, here I am 20 some years later, and I'm still, you know, pulling from those texts, and putting the energy and the essence, the soul of what he wrote, you know, in some of the things that I'm trying to write. So I would say, you know, by far, he's my biggest influence.
Is Du Bois' Souls of Black Folk you read?
Yeah, absolutely.
For me, well, one, it's interesting that someone already mentioned Classics Illustrated, because yeah, Classics Illustrated was huge to me. I knew, you know, as the kid in 5th grade, 4th grade, who knew who Charles Dickens was and Robert Louis Stevenson and Herman Melville. And, you know, in one capacity or another, I'd already read Moby Dick in Tale of the Two Cities and things like that. So that was a huge influence. I didn't realize how much of an influence it would be later in life in terms of the educational possibilities of comics. But in terms of writers and influences and heroes, or whatever you want to call them, for me, it's got to be James Baldwin. You know, James Baldwin is the writer who is everything to me, and to the extent that even sometimes when I'm writing and thinking about what I'm going to write, the voice in my head is almost talking with the James Baldwin cadence, because James Baldwin had a very specific way of talking, and so when I'm writing, I sometimes will go there, and yeah, it's just. And sometimes even when I just want to be when I really want to have, for lack of a better term, my creative batteries recharged, I'll just listen to, you know, I'll go onto YouTube and find some clips of him talking, and just really, and because the beautiful thing about him was that he, you know, he worked in both fiction and he did nonfiction, and that he was a thinker and a storyteller, and just he was coming from a place of it always felt like deep truth. And I never thought that much about being a writer. It was always like, oh yeah, I'd like to be a writer. I'd like to make comics. But I remember reading James Baldwin, I was probably about 18 or 19. And it was the first time where I had an emotional response that I felt like I want to be able to replicate this for other people at some point. I doubt that I know I haven't done it yet, and I may never do it, but it's still a lofty goal.
I respect that. Yeah, he's great. He's great.
Well, I had nothing until David gave me some inspiration here at the end, thankfully, because I was just sitting. I was such an indiscriminate reader as a young person. I just read everything. I mean, Reader's Digest, drama in real life was probably one of my huge inspirations, because I get stuck at a grandmother's house in Florida in the summers, and I just had nothing to read but like 50 years of these Reader's Digest stories. And I was always drawn to to bringing these that anybody at any time could live something that was noteworthy. And it really came down to your perspective of, like, you know, of drilling into it and sharing that story. There's something sort of oddly Hemingway about appreciating that, maybe, because a guy would just sit down and write a book about, you know, a story about going fishing or whatever. But as far as, I would say, and this is sort of embarrassing to admit in this day and age, but I think it was probably Hunter Thompson was probably the first person I read as it was like, oh, I want to do something like that. And I think I quickly learned I didn't want to be the crazy person, but I was sort of like, I want to be able to have a visceral, I want to write words and have people pay attention to them. And then he was a guy that ended up having multiple outlets, not only of his writing, long before there were blogs. You know, he would end up having columns and all this kind of stuff. That led to a more deep appreciation of folks like Tom Wolfe and Ken Kesey and some other a little bit more traditional sort of authors and observers of human behavior. But I think it did sort of boil down to Hunter Thompson. He liked to look at the ordinary and see the grotesque in sort of everything. And I've definitely borrowed that as a foundation of my sort of skepticness of looking at the world, questioning things, not just taking everything for granted, with or without all of his allusions to drugs and alcohol, you know.
Great. And guys, I have so many more questions, but we are running out of time. And we just got a question from Ken Wolken, which I actually think is a really important question and kind of an inspiration for the panel, actually. So it's interesting that it was asked. He says, I think it's important to make the distinction between comics, and in parentheses, he said, when I was growing up, they were called funny books, and graphic novels. And I'd just like your take on that. I certainly have thoughts on it, but I'd love to hear it from you guys.
Well, to me, it's primarily its length. You know, a comic book is 20-something pages, whereas a graphic novel you tend to need a bookmark for because they're longer. But I also think that there's the potential of what you can do in a graphic novel, in part because of just the number of pages, but also in that the medium itself is maturing through. It's difficult for the medium to mature 22 pages at a time. Okay, it can be done, but it's very, very difficult. In fact, I mean, what Spiegelman did with Mouse was an evolution, increments at a time. But a book like March, or even the Black Panther Party, or a lot of what we're seeing, it's change happening at 150 pages or more, and I think that's it's easier for libraries to carry books like this, and it's easier for teachers the teachers that are open-minded to using them to justify it, and the binding is just, it's amazing what binding does, right? When it's folded and stapled, it's a throwaway periodical, but when it's got a perfect spine and it's a book, and I think a lot of it's almost aesthetic, and with that aesthetic, there's it's the perception that comes with it.
David, I'm sorry to jump in, Brian, but David, that reminds me of like the sea change that happened when paperbacks were invented.
Yeah.
Right. It made this thing sort of accessible, and that's sort of like when you take in comic strips, comic book, 3-panel Dick Tracy comic strip eventually evolved into a 150-page, 200-page book about the Black Panther Party that David here could create. And yes, but once you realize that they're better off as these full, complete stories, it's like it's a inversion of the serialization model that we're so familiar with. It's Netflix dropping a full season at once and HBO stringing out for 8 weeks. Which one is more satisfying as an end viewer? If the intent was always to binge, I would argue that the paperback is better, or that full thing is better, because you don't have any of the filler necessary to fill out the other contractual requirements you may have been forced to meet.
Yeah, no, like that's prime right there, because I prefer getting everything at once, but like I'm a huge soap opera fan. So like that daily soap opera, like I used to watch it with my mom, like, Young and the Restless, like that daily, like I want to know what's going to happen next. I like the fact that there's a cliffhanger. I do think that the name of comic books should change probably, because the whole idea of like, and I'm not sure about the origin of the comic part, but I'm thinking it has something to do with like being funny, which is why it extends from the comic, like the funny book part. But if we went to something more like graphic novella, even for a 22 pager, instead of like now we're like a 50 or 60 or 40 to 60 is like a graphic novella. But if we extended it all the way back to where these 22, 24 page books are also graphic novellas, I think the perception will change. And, that stigma or whatever will kind of erode, go away. And that this medium, can be embraced on a larger scale. Words have power, as we all know. And I think, what we call something does matter. I understand that comic books are dope, are great, and you can get a lot from them. There's power in them. But, there's another group that, comic book, what? Well, it's a little harder to say graphic novella, like, so, yeah.
I'm gonna start calling my old Havoc Wolverine meltdown issues the graphic novellas now. You've convinced me. Roman Palumbo suggests graphic episodes, and David Miller suggests graphic short stories. All great names. We'll have to settle it later. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much to David, Justin, and Brian for joining us tonight. You can, at your local comic store or your local bookstore, pick up They Called Us Enemy by George Takei and Eigener, Scott, and Becker. You can also, of course, pick up David Walker and Marcus Kwame Anderson's Black Panther Party graphic novel. And you can still get your local comic store, get issue 1 of Black Cotton, which is in its 2nd or 3rd printing now, right?
Second, yes.
Yeah, and the brand new issue 2 comes out tomorrow, so you're just in time. So this has been really great. I thank you so much. I want to thank again Lowell Institute for their generous support of our program. As you put together your future plans, I also wanted to flag some of our upcoming programs, Revolutionary Spaces. To mark Preservation Month, please join us for Beyond Boston, Old South Meeting House's global construction on Saturday, May 29th. Old South's architecture speaks to Boston's identity in the 18th century Puritan town with English aesthetics that was deeply involved in triangular Atlantic trade. And we also encourage you to check out our history-themed late-night format comedy show, Tea Party Tonight, hosted by Rob Green on June 23rd. You can find out more on our website, revolutionaryspaces.org/events. And please follow us on social media at Revolutionary Spaces. Sign up for our newsletter and consider a donation to Rev Spaces to help support programs like this. Thank you, everyone. Stay well. Have a great night. This has been fantastic.
Thank you. It was great, guys.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, everybody, for putting this together. This is great.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.